Um, so the final panel, so my name is Sudeshna Mitra, and I am here at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. And I'd like to welcome you all to the final panel of the conference, which is called Urban Equity and Planning. And we have a very interesting set of papers today. And across all of the papers, there is an engagement with state action. And the ways in which it is sort of creating, sustaining, or exacerbating the social and spatial inequalities in the city. The papers range from looking at the methods and tools that are used in planning to the use of the vocabulary of formal and informal in settlement upgrading. The Smart Cities mission in India and how it relates to the SDGs, to also how the state is dealing with the settling of competing claims on land. Right? So as you can sort of tell from the range of papers that there is a sort of a very conscious kind of a focus on methods, on tools, on vocabulary, on institutional mechanisms. And so in a way, it's a very nice sort of a meso-level engagement with the situated and spatialized actions of the state. And in each of the papers, there is a very sort of a clear interrogation of the kind of value systems that are actually embedded in these practices. Oftentimes, they're not called out as a value system, but there is very clearly a value system that's playing through these practices. So without too much delay, I'd like to invite the first paper. If you would start with a brief introduction.
Good afternoon, everybody. Are we on? Yep, thank you. The three of us are going to be looking at, obviously the title, looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and the right to the city, but a more particular look and focus on the financial aspects and the social aspects of the Smart Cities mission here in India, and with a focus on Pune. So by way of introduction, I want to just indicate that we're here today as part of a grant project that we recently secured. And so we've really just begun a process of collaboration. And what we're intending to do is to look at the relationship between marginality and India's Smart Cities mission from the perspective of Hunter Lefebvre's right to the city proposition. Our project also involves some work that Farouk has done with the Center for Financial Accountability in Delhi. The overview of the presentation, Farouk will start off with a discussion of the research that he conducted with CFA back this summer, and then we'll move to a report from Ravikant looking at field research that he's conducted with students at Flame University in Pune, and then that'll bring a particular focus on the question of social accountability, highlight the importance of caste in that discussion, and especially for thinking about inequality and inequity. And then at the end, I'll offer some considerations about the problem of inequality and equity from the perspective of the Sustainable Development Goals, Habitat 3, and the Smart Cities mission. So the invitation for you guys, for the audience, the central question perhaps that we would like for you to consider is presented. So if you can keep this in mind as we're presenting and thinking about stuff, I think that would be useful. So, how do we see, how do we understand, how do we make sense of the intersections between financial and social accountability, or really lack of accountability, as they pertain to the persistence of inequality and inequity within India's continued process of urbanization. I think that's probably the best way to frame what we're considering, what we're looking at in our research.
Hello? All right, good. So, hi. Thank you for having us. I focused on the nitty-gritty of the financing mechanisms of the Smart City mission. And just a disclaimer before I move ahead. The data for the Smart Cities mission is still coming in, so there's a lot of stuff that we don't... Oh. Is it on? Oh, he turned it off.
I did.
You did? Oh, it's off. Does this work? Okay, sweet. So the data for the Smart City mission is still coming in, and a lot of that has to do with kind of how it's designed, and as I'm sure many people who looked at the Smart Cities mission know, the incredibly short 5-year time frame in which Modi promised 100 smart cities. So obviously, you're not going to do that in 5 years. But my work right now and the data we have currently has been looking at the main financing mechanisms and the overall outcome and the lack of success in a lot of cities in implementing these. So I created this pretty little chart. I'm trying to make financing sexy, but clearly it's not that sexy. So basically, it can be broken down into 3 ways. And then the third way is where everything kind of becomes just a whole shitstorm. So the government of India initially gives a special purpose vehicle. Now, a special purpose vehicle is a private entity created by the state and the city to implement all smart city projects and all smart city financing. The special purpose vehicle is a private entity, which allows it certain tax breaks and certain legal privileges that a public entity otherwise would not have. Examples of this include certain not disclosing certain things, such as like, oh, we did this, or oh, we spent that. So a lot of leeway there, and again, we'll talk about the transparency aspect of that. So the government of India initially gives 500 crore to every smart city SPV as seed funding, and the state must then match the 500 crore with its own mechanisms. However the state can find 500 crore over 5 years, the state will give 500 crore. So that's 1,000 crore. And then this is the hodgepodge of other mechanisms. I'm not going to read them, but these mechanisms is where it starts to get a little bit trickier because they are very neoliberal and business friendly, and they endanger the public space, and they also endanger the public budget. So you have public-private partnerships, the selling of municipal bonds and special purpose vehicle shares, because the SPV is a private company. It actually has shares that it can sell to build revenue for itself. User charges, so that would include like if in Pune, for example, if they extend a sewer system or extend a road or anything like that, they can implement like a toll booth or charge you for using that service. Debt financing. Debt financing is a smaller aspect of this, but debt financing mainly comes from Indian banks. And then direct private sector operation. So this is when public-private partnerships do not work and the state or city does not want to get its hands dirty with developing it. So they will just find the land or find the project and directly allow the private sector to develop it and then profit off it for a tenured amount of time. It's usually about between 5 and 10 years. Which one's the next button? Okay, so I'll just start from a macro level and try and move downwards. So the issues in financing. One of the issues is the inability of the state and the cities to utilize the money that's being given to them by the government. This is information directly pulled from Rajya Sabha debates. I'm sorry if I'm butchering the name, but this is data that the government has publicly released. So as you can see, the government has released money at a fairly okay clip, and then for the first 3 years there was a solid amount of that being spent, and then in the third year or fourth year there was a drop off due to like a lot of issues in PPP and the tendering process, which I will get into. But the states and the cities are ill-equipped to develop a smart city. And I mean, the definition of a smart city is vast, and it's kind of hard to really pinpoint like what a city looks like if it's smart. So they're going with the like the popular fixes like Wi-Fi for all, CCTVs, an app. Actually, this is if you guys are interested. There are a bunch of smart city apps for different cities. So like my favorite is the Bhopal Smart City app. It's just a screen with a picture of Bhopal and then like the time. Doesn't even tell you the temperature. But so that is one of the issues. The next issue comes with the state trying to provide this 500 crores. They don't have 500 crores. Even though, 500 crores is chump change in the grand scheme of things. In a case study that I did for the Center for Financial Accountability, a environmental protection firm actually sued the Union of India about indoor smart city, saying it was violative of about 14 constitutional rights. And this has to do with one of the biggest things was that indoor actually cut its education budget by 21% and cut its health department budget by 18% in order to accommodate the upcoming charges for the smart city. Also, the poor financial situation of the states and the cities allows a heavy reliance on the private sector. And India's been through this with structural adjustment programs in the 90s, but it's kind of just repackaged itself through public-private partnerships and things like that. Basically, the capacity to implement this in the city is not there, and they're heavily relying on the private sector, which again creates issues in the right to the city question and whose city is it if none of it is owned by the public. So this is just a little bit. Oh, sorry. So this comes from the Pune Special Purpose Vehicle Annual Report. As you can see, there are 11 projects that they have listed completed. But here's the catch. Only a recent audit, and this actually came out a few days ago, a recent audit reported that only 5 of the 41 projects were actually completed, even though the SPV reported 11 completed projects. So again, we have an issue in transparency and what the public knows. That is a direct quote from one of the people they interviewed. And he asked, audit report cleared that most smart city projects are pending. What did they spend the funds on then? Most of the tenders have been processed. What is the reason for the delay? We have sought an explanation on this. And then the next part is, which I didn't directly state because they will be better at it, there is no citizen engagement. They initially, when the smart city started, they put out surveys and questions on WhatsApp and Instagram and Facebook, and that's what they kind of said they based their things on. And they also did community work, so they went into certain communities in the ABB area and asked them, "What do you want?" And then they took that advice and then didn't use it in any of the implementation. But again, also using WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, you have to wonder who the hell is actually being surveyed. Probably not the people that need the most help. So, to summarize in a nice short package, the selling of the city to finance the smart city. Here are the problems. Lack of federal and state funding, financial risks that come from PPPs. So public-private partnerships, really popular, but they have a horrible track record. They usually fizzle out within about 5 to 8 years in the contract, and then it requires the public sector to bail them out because you already have a good that needs to keep running or else the functionality of the city is compromised. The need for debt financing, again, states can't really handle the commitments. Role of politics and special interests, and then the selling of municipal bonds and shares, which thus decreases the amount of the city that the people actually own and puts the city's credit rating at risk if anything fails. So I'll go ahead and pass it off.
All right. I think we are running short of time, which is scary because there's a lot of stuff that we had to still cover. What Farooq has done is he's given us about a glimpse into the financial and philosophical funding problems with the smart city issue, with the smart cities mission. What I'll briefly, quickly try and do is look at the social accountability aspect of it. Now, there are many approaches to social accountability. I will not spend time talking about it. But in the context of urban social inequality and what its policy implications are, one of the things that we kind of are looking in a very central fashion is a role played by caste. Now, one of the things that we have to keep in mind that cities in South Asia, especially in India, have historically been organized both spatially and commercially across the lines of caste. You can look at the wholesale market of any big city like Bada Bazaar in Calcutta, and you'll immediately understand what I'm talking about. And caste is not just a division of labor, as Ambedkar has talked about, it's a division of laborers. So the labor of intellectualizing the imagination of urban planning is also a site of that study then. What I mean by that is, like, for instance, routinely over the last 2 days, we've seen a lot of, in the Indian context, a lot of analysis from a gendered and a class lens of the city. But we haven't seen so much about caste. It's considered too innate, too complicated, too dense. This is misleading because you just need to stand at the gate outside and look across the road. There's a Sattvic restaurant right there. Caste is everywhere, in that sense. And it's an important social marker, spatial marker, to understand and identify vulnerable and precarious communities. And in the case of Pune, which has always been a Brahmin upper caste city from its origin, from the Peshwa period in that sense, if we quickly look at how this now gets translated into the smart city thing. So I will not spend a lot of time. I'll quickly jump. So this is the geographical map of Pune as of recent times. And historically, the city was located around this axis, but in more recent times, it's expanded in these regions, and also in the opposite direction. This is primarily fueled by a shift of the old Pune elites by buying real estate in these outer areas and the emergence of the IT industry, and it's also reflected in the reflection and the growth of its satellite towns on the outskirts. Very quickly, these are the areas that I'll mostly rush through in talking. This is the camp area. It's one of the oldest communities in Pune. It's about 152 years of continuous habitation. It's an urban hub which is in decline. This is the ABB area, Aund, Baner, Balewadi, which is what Farooq was talking about. It's a focus of the smart city space. It's a place in Pune where you'll get the biggest real estate boom right now. It's the axis along which development, quote unquote, is happening. And this is Bavdan, which is the next upcoming space. So very quickly, the past, future, and present in that sense. And if we look at Bavdan and we focus in on the original village side, it's a story of two parallel roads, this one and this one. This is where the old village exists, and this is where real estate development has happened across two lines. And if I just map some dynamics into it, the big separation between these two roads is a massive garbage dump, followed by this little canal, which is the filthiest canal in this part of town. It's basically a garbage collection dump. And right next to the garbage dump is the Dalit housing area. And a little distance away from it is the Maratha area, which is geographically a little separated, but slightly better in terms of financial organization. But if you combine what's happening on the other side, where the earlier agricultural fields of this village were there, is where you're going to see upper caste predominantly dominated by Brahmin housing societies which have come up. And now, if you map on this where the smart city intervention has happened, it's in this axis where the smart city funding and innovation has come in. Whatever little work that has happened has gone in this space. It's not solved this problem. And what is the intervention? They have put in these bicycles which you can download an app with and use to move around, and a public toilet on this stretch of the road, which is a few distance away. So clearly you're seeing the need of the class need of a community over the more traditional neighborhood in that sense. And I'll quickly jump through. I'm sorry if I'm rushing. And now quickly rushing to the older part of town, which is Camp. And again, it's a story of two parallel roads. You have the MG road, and you have the East Street. And MG Road is bordered by this area, which is a huge Muslim ghetto, for instance. And this is a closer area. This is characterized by massive ghettoization, cramped housing, poor sanitation of the worst kind, and it's under constant surveillance. Maharashtra has also seen a lot of politics on the question of beef. There is a buffalo slaughterhouse around this area, and there are constant CCTV cameras and police patrolling, and the citizens and people who live there report this state of anxiety of constantly being under the gaze. But the urban renewal and heritage conservation effort is on the opposite street, literally separated by 800 meters, where you will see all kinds of old colonial structures, the British legacy and the Parsi architecture, which is being identified as the heritage project of Pune. So again, like you're going to see like a gap between delivery and requirement. And coming the Pune Smart City website will actually talk about. And if you look at this area, this is the axis. It's basically this one long road which starts from Balewadi, Baner and Aund. And this is like where the Smart City office is located. I have helpfully used an appropriate icon to depict it. If you see, it's these two parallel roads which are going, and in between these parallel roads are like lots of areas of invisibility. Like for instance, there's a space called Lamantanda, which you will not even find on Google Map. It's the housing of this denotified tribal community who are seen as constitutionally, they were identified in the colonial times as a criminal tribe. And they are housed in that space, like almost hidden from plain view, but sandwiched between two areas of massive real estate development. And even in Balewadi village, just hidden from the plain road, you have the main village and low income housing. Now, if you combine this with what's actually where the intervention of the focus of the SCM is happening again. In the Balewadi village, there are no sidewalks. We actually went on this while I was giving them this tour. Whatever little work has happened, there are LED street lamps to save energy, but there is no sidewalk. So the lamppost has literally been built on soil, and there is human shit and feces next to it. So the gap between priorities is baffling in that sense. And another area where traffic management and road works has been built in, which is another low-income housing. What typically starts happening is once you start building roads, the big real estate lobby comes in, and then that starts developing in that sense. So I'm kind of done. So what you're essentially I'm so sorry. The key takeaways here is that the development of vulnerable and precarious communities clearly does not seem to be the focus of the Smart Cities mission. If at all, it is aimed at creating more real estate banks where upper caste capital can go park itself in terms of building more properties. And you're seeing the zones of exclusion, pocket island villages hidden in plain sight between areas of high development on either side, and Dalits, Muslims, lower caste groups, migrants particularly vulnerable. So just to add like a social dynamic to the financial thing, I don't know where we are with time, but like, okay.
I can do this in 2 sentences. Yeah. I will dispense with my portion of the presentation. The 2 sentences would be that obviously a lack of social accountability and financial accountability is going to undermine the approach in Smart City Mission to do equity and equality. And then the fundamental question is, why is that the case? The argument that I would be making is that it's rooted in the Sustainable Development Goals, Habitat 3, and their use of the right to the city that is an inclusive, liberal, internationalist epistemic that is a fundamental betrayal of Honolulu Fave's notion of the right to the city, which is anti-capitalist and articulates a radically different vision than what we've heard over the past 2 days.
Actually, so one of the presenters from the first paper has to head out early. So we'll just do a very quick round of, if there are any quick questions, I'd like to ask you to kind of keep the questions a little short. For all the other papers, we'll do a session at the end with all the questions. But since they have to sort of take off, so if somebody has some burning question they want to ask, please let us know.
Thank you for that. That was very enlightening. I myself have worked on the Bangalore Smart Cities projects actually. So I'm in complete agreement with what you all just said. I think one of the things that, through my experience, that I felt is the role of the politics that is so great in the smart cities. It's really about like a few people that make the decisions, and it's just about convincing your local MLAs or your local politicians. And there's a complete lack of social accountability, like you all said. Of course, there are surveys done to check boxes, but these never translate into the outcome of it. I would like you all to stress a little bit about the role of the political as well.
Are there any other questions? Okay.
Yeah, so this is a BJP pet project, as most of BJP's projects are. If you look at the entire financing of it, it is absolute peanuts. Most smart cities are being given 2,000 crore to build over 50 projects. It's absolute nonsense. The role of politics, however, is also rooted in the role of making as much money for everyone in the tendering process. One of the biggest problems with PPPs in India is the tendering process. It takes the SPV will release I want to build, 100 LED lights. Please send in how you're going to do that for me and at what cost. Then there are about 6 different actors who then determine if they want some company to take that person or company, say be like Tata. So, Tata sends in, I will build you 100 LED street lights for this amount of money. And then they go, and here's a couple, here's like 1 lakh, 2 lakh, take it, and then, get back to me. And so what we've seen is they're intentionally stalling the development of the smart city project to fatten their pockets by taking money from a host of different companies that are sending in tenders, which is one of the biggest problems. It took about 4 years to develop just one SPV, it's insane.
I'm sorry, I'll just quickly add to what he's saying. I'll maybe even say something a little controversial because that's my personal reading here. Tendering process is a huge problem, but I think it also calls into the question, if you're politically resourceful, to imagine a new frame of corruption in that sense. Because the earlier idea of corruption and scams in India is exactly what he's talking about. You tender something and then you, for personal gains, you say that, okay, you go with not the most profitable tender. Now here is a case, a policy framework has been announced, but the goals are not announced. So a smart city has to be delivered, but we don't know what has to be done, which creates space for a business-to-business market by tech companies to come out. I was at this event in Delhi a couple of months ago, organized by private tech companies, honoring about 25 smart city commissioners. They were all so it's tech companies, Wipro, TCS, and so on and so forth, honoring smart city commissioners for the great work they have done. And when you went into the hotel, I think I was the only academic there because it felt like a business affair, and you entered, you had all these stalls. So it's like tech companies are going to smart city officers and saying, we are a tech company, we know what smart business is, you need to build a command and control center. Oh, by the way, we can help you build it. So now, and this is a architecture that is not just limited to the smart cities, because there's a parallel program which has also been launched by this government. It's called the Aspirational Districts Program. You take, I don't know what this love with the number 100 is, you take 100 backward districts and then we are going to develop them. But once again, what are those parameters? Are they being audited? It's not been clear. So in that sense, if you are a private player, you can set your own guidelines which suit your own business needs, and then you can service yourself. So in that sense, it's created space for a wholesale, like I think the slide title that he said is quite accurate. The selling of the city has begun. I think in that sense, it's a very alarming situation. 100 cities have been sold off. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to be looking at how spatial plans address the poor. And my talk is titled Planning and Inequality. To give a brief context of where this presentation is coming from, I would like to say that I spent the last 10 to 15, like nearly 2 decades, working as an urban planning consultant, and I have worked on urban plans across scales, doing plans like the Mumbai Development Plan, the Mumbai Metropolitan Regional Plan, and I've been fortunate to work both within and outside government. So obviously, you know, as you go through these plans, you ask yourself the question then, why are we faced with the kind of dual cities that we see all around us? What is the purpose of these plans which don't seem to really fructify, you know, which pushed me to to pursue a doctoral dissertation, and where I interrogated, the title was Interrogating Land Use Planning in India, and so this presentation actually looks at, is drawing from that work, and what I've looked at is the knowledge, the underlying knowledge base of urban planning. I've looked at the institutional structures that, this is during my thesis, I've looked at the underlying institutional structures that within which urban planning is housed, and also looked at planners' attitudes, and it's a combination of these three things that actually end up in the spatial plans that we as planners deliver. And it was also very useful to look through Tanya Lee's lens of urban planning practices as an expert culture. What does it mean? And I found that very useful, and it helped describe the nature of urban planning practice. But in today's presentation, I thought what I would do is focus more squarely, and I think since time is so short, I thought it would be useful to use the planners' attitudes and how planners view their tasks. And I've interviewed planners across in Maharashtra, because my work was in Mumbai. I looked at particularly the Mumbai development plans, and so I talked to senior planners in Mumbai and the Mumbai Metropolitan Regional Development Authority, but also looked at senior retired chief planners at the TCPO, the Town and Country Planning Organization. So I will be starting there, and then I'm going to move to Mumbai and show you some of the actual plans and how what is their spatial impact on the poor, and hopefully through that we get a sense of the methods and the tools and the underlying content, which is largely colonial, and we heard a lot about from other contexts that how there's a need to decolonize the knowledge of our practices. So I will start here, and I think this is very interesting. Ex-senior planner at MCGM, first question, when I ask him, what do you think about planning, how would you define it? He says, it's about land. It's not about people. And I was really taken aback. Ex-chief planner, Town Country Planning Organization, when I said I'm doing a dissertation with School of Habitat Studies, he quickly trying to fob me off, saying, habitat is not my area. My area is planning. And I would limit myself to physical planning, development plans, master plans. And so, you know, he went on to say that we just demarcate certain lands for planning, for residential and commercial use, etc., etc. And planners definitely, so they definitely see their role as a very limited one, you know. They do not, and at the same time, they don't see it as an exclusionary plan. You know, they say that as far as the DP or the master plan is concerned, nobody is excluded. Everybody is included. Take any park and playground. Where does it say? Am I labeling that it's for the rich or the poor? It's for everyone, right? So everybody is a free citizen of India. Everyone can use it. So obviously, this is planners. You speak to any planner, you know, there's no sense that what they're doing, that the plans are exclusionary. And they see it largely, if there's any problem, they see it as a problem of enforcement, of implementation, and they start looking at, you know, it's the authorities who should have been making sure that these amenities are there for people. So it's definitely something that they see as not a problem of the plan itself. The plan is okay, it's the implementation, or it's the authorities who are bringing, or there are politicians who are actually allowing for personal gain, getting people to encroach on these lands that we have marked for various amenities. And then you come to this view that actually the plan is not a suitable instrument to address problems of the urban poor. Very clearly stated, right? So why are these, you know, on one hand, we come to forums like these, and even as a planner who was trained at Berkeley, you have a sense that probably you can do something for everybody that's more equitable, that's inclusive. And when you look at what you're doing, you find that you're up against this kind of attitude that the DP is not a suitable instrument to resolve problems of the poor. The problems of the urban poor are to be resolved through basically sectoral policies, programs, and projects. So this, I think, is very, very telling. And the acts under which these urban spatial plans come, which provide the legal framework that makes them these statutory documents and provide the framework for preparation and implementation, do not, and I thought this was also very, very interesting, it says that the plan document itself does not generally intend to or claim to solve the problems of the urban poor. So I thought this is very, very necessary, because we seem to take it for granted that a good plan is going to deliver equity. And plans definitely do not cognize poverty, as this senior ex-chief planner tells us. Has planning cognized poverty? The answer is no. Have planners understood what poverty is? The answer is no. And then he went on to say that if the planners are solely responsible, does the bureaucrat, do the decision makers, do the politicians, you know, are they interested in knowing what poverty is? And he said the answer is no, which left me with this big question then, you know, what are we talking about? I'm going to end this section on the attitudes of the planners with this quote, which I think says it all, and says it very, very clearly lays out what is it that planners do, what is their task, and why is it that spatial plans are exclusionary in nature. Because they are not particularly inclusive for any specific economic class by design. They are exclusionary by their very nature. They are statutory land use plans limited by the term development in the Act. So in the Act, the term development is only about land use development, and it's not socio-economic. And that is at the root of why plans are unable to address issues of equity. Plans make provisions for a specific targeted population without going into the details of the different categories of people, leave alone understanding their needs and policies. So it is the generalist, and I think this last line says it all. The generalist approach of the plan leaves matters open for economic forces to derive benefit from the same. And that's where the plans are. You know, you draw up this plan which is assigning uses, reserving lands for some general projected population based on standards and tools. which are coming from somewhere else, imported colonial framework. And so the lands are assigned, the plan has these colors on them. And I'm going to move to just give you a quick sense of what the spatial plans are. And Mumbai has had 3 statutory plans. 1967 was the first one, followed by the 91, and then very recently the 2018 one. That was a little complicated story. I was involved in the 3rd exercise, which is not part of this presentation, because it was still evolving when I was studying these plans. So very quickly, 1967, on your right is the final DP. The Survey of India map there is just to give you an indication that at that point in the 60s, it was only the island city to the south, to the bottom of the map, that was inhabited, and the suburbs, the large areas you could see, are open, still available for development. What is the planner's response? So they set a population, a projected population. The population at that time was 4.15 million. They set a population which is about 7 million and proposed 5 commercial centers, somewhere between the suburbs and the island city. They propose major housing reservations. Now this is very interesting. We are under a socialist government. The planning is a tool of government. So you have these reservations, but very quickly after, there's a big policy shift to housing finance. So these reservations are not really actualized, but they're there in the plan. And then, and how do you address areas which are considered slums? And there are a whole definition of what is a slum. Anything that just doesn't fit a standard of good habitable space, which doesn't have sanitation attached to it. So there are slum clearance schemes. So this is that era where slum clearance is considered as a tool. Reclamation is a tool to increase supply of land. And then you have FSI. So you have these are the strategies, and this is what the plan is. 1999, by that time, 20 years later, you begin to see the population is now 8.23 million. It's overridden, it's the target population of the previous plan. The slum population, which I did not mention in the previous plan, was 70.75 lakhs, has now quadrupled to 2.89 million. And you have very similar strategies of curtailing growth. Thrust of both plans: dispersal, deconcentration, segregating users. These are the modes, these are the typical responses that planners have to address issues on the ground, and they highlight for me what is the pursuit of planners, which is to do with visual order, balance, ideas of insufficiency, incompatibility. So notions that come out of a modernist principles of planning. And what you see is, this is where the 4 points that I feel, what is the spatial impact of the plans on the poor? Each plan, when it comes up with these proposals, automatically, necessarily means displacement. For any proposal to come through that is there in the plan, it means that some households somewhere are getting displaced. In the DP 1967, it was about 20,000 households. In DP 1991, as many as 8 lakh plus households were to be displaced. And luckily for us, those households, it was through urban renewal of areas within the island city that would have caused that kind of displacement. Luckily, did not go through. Essentially, what it ends up, what I wanted to say is that there are 4 ways in which the poor in the city are affected, because we are pursuing certain standards of desirable standards, and we prepare these layouts, and we are reducing the quantum of available land. We increase congestion, therefore, on the remaining areas which are outside of this prescribed development control. And very interestingly, I'll show you in the next slide, which is the last slide, how we are indirectly responsible, the plans are indirectly responsible for where informal development occurs. And finally, through the development controls, the kind of controls on how much to build and what is the FSI, the floor space index, one sees that actually in Mumbai we have curtailed development and indirectly then decreased the supply of space for building, increased land costs, and therefore decreased affordability, and in turn then made it difficult for urban poor to they've increased slums and made it difficult for people to actually have homes in the city. So I'm going to just very quickly show you that in the colonial times, and I think Mumbai, we've always heard about the scarcity of land, starts during the colonial times with the Bombay Improvement Trust, large layouts, as many as 33 layouts in the city, and 10% of the urban land was made, had these planned layouts. So that's what I mean, that land is already put aside and developed for certain sections of society. And it crunches the available land for the rest of the people. And when you go to the DP, you start seeing how much of land is now reserved and opened up for development. Go into the DP 1991, more colors on the map, more reservations. So we are constantly upping because we are pursuing certain standards. We're saying this much of land has to be reserved. And very, very interesting is this last slide. What we are seeing here is an overlay of the DP 91 reservations on the map. And what you will see is that those are the places, very places where the slums are. So it's a very interesting that indirectly then, the only spaces left over which are open which are not controlled and developed, become then the spaces, the marginal leftover spaces. The reservations are not actualized, and sometimes the slums are induced, or reservations are actually put on settlements in the hope that you will actualize them through slum redevelopment. So in either case, either when there's a reservation put on an existing slum, or when it's induced, I'm sorry. And then this is the absolute last slide, which says then therefore one can say that development plans directly create then the spaces of poverty and exclusion. And to borrow from Benjamin Davies' frame, where he says spaces of wealth are central, endowed, sanitized, and formalized, and as against that we create these spaces of poverty, marginal, diminished, and polluted and informal. So the provocation really, and through my own work, one sees that in pursuit of certain standards which are not contextual, and certain tools and modes of working where we don't have data about the poor, we actually end up in this pursuit of ideal spatial models that underlie planning practice in India. We are creating these spaces. We are not able to at all build for the poor, and we're creating and reinforcing these urban, these dual cities in India. Thank you.
Johanna? Yes. And the mic, I don't know.
Hello. Yes. Hello, everybody. My name is Johanna. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the School of Architecture at the University of Queensland. And what I'm presenting today is my PhD research, which I finished last year. So why this research? I looked at the enduring conceptual dichotomy between formal and informal sectors in planning discourse and practice. And this dichotomy is problematic because it's a justification for the dominant neoliberal model of urban development. This dichotomy presents informal development practices as illegitimate and illegal, but what I'm most interested in is there is an eager to formalize the informal and a perpetuation of an individual model obscuring collective relationships to the city. So within this formal and informal dichotomy, there is also an individual and collective dichotomy, because most formalization processes formalize with individual property rights, and this is problematic in my opinion. So I asked the question, how can the understanding of formal and informal relationships in land use practices in Phnom Penh contribute to planning knowledge for urban equality in the Global South? And to understand these relationships, I found four key concepts that help me frame these relationships. One is the conceptualization of formal and informal dichotomy as a governmental tool. So it's how the state uses this dichotomy for its advantage, and usually at the expense of vulnerable groups. Also, the state's implication in producing and reproducing informality, and gray spaces as spaces of vulnerability and also possibilities. And also an argument which says that formalization is a liberal attempt at restructuring property relations for accumulation and control. It's a little bit hard, but I think it's important for questions of social justice and equality. And this is what frames my findings. So my methodology, I did a case study of one informal settlement in Phnom Penh. You can see the settlement here. It's not it's not a poor settlement because it has had a history of transformation over time. I did document reviews. I collected live stories from residents in this settlement. And I did interviews with representatives from government, NGOs, banks, and microfinance institutions. I work very closely with a Khmer research partner who I continue to be in touch with and conduct research in Phnom Penh. And I got ethics approval from my university, but most importantly, I was welcomed and supported from community leaders and members of this community who I worked before. So I just want to point out a little bit of history in Cambodia, which is important to understand. So the origins of this formal dichotomy were introduced in Cambodia from the French in the colonial era. And this is when a hierarchy was created between formal and informal practices, undermining traditional relationships to land and practices to place. And that was reproduced through different city-making practices over time. But what happened in Cambodia, which was very unfortunate but very relevant to understand, is that during the Khmer Rouge era, all land records were destroyed, and so everything became informal in a way. And so what is formal and informal is very hard to define. And again, when the country opened to the neoliberal and economic free market, the land records were reintroduced in the country, and these created problems for informal settlements, especially because the context of Cambodia has evolved in a very aggressive foreign investment context with land commodification and this jointed model of governance where the government works in complicity with the private sector. So informal settlements in Cambodia, with these new land laws, they became as temporary settlements. So they are not informal nor formal. They are temporary because they are not registered in the land register. And this happens also with other land, like public land. So what is considered informal is temporary. And this creates many vulnerabilities because they are subject to the state. There is a long history of evictions in Phnom Penh, where most informal settlements have been moved down to relocated to the outskirts of the city. So there are not many informal settlements in the center. And the main responses to land insecurity has been a program which has evolved over time called the Land Management Administration Program. And basically, it's a model of systematic land registration with the end outcome of having individual title. There are, of course, other models that have been precedents by the Asian Coalition for Housing Right and the Urban Community Development Fund Network. However, my research was really focused on the LMAP, which was a multi-donor program funded by different donors, which invested a lot of money in this program. All the donors have pulled out of this program now, and it's in the hands of the state alone. So this is the settlement that I study. This settlement, people came after the Civil War. They were previous soldiers. With the consent of the government, they settled here. And they started subdivided some of the land with other people that came from all refugee camps and other areas after the Civil War. And people settled here for many years. They live secure with a record called Ploton, which is like an informal record, but it's in the middle because it's not either informal nor formal. It's something in the middle. And this is what Oren Giftafel calls us the people here living in a gray space, because they are not formal or informal. They live in an ambiguous state, and in a state of permanent temporariness. So people settled here for many years. They constructed a life. They had many relationships, together collectively. They built their houses and the infrastructure of the settlement, and they work and play and have parties in the settlement. So there's this collectivity in the area that, of course, goes beyond exchange value. So these relationships to place are very important to understand when I talk about that individual-collective dichotomy, because usually this dichotomy obscures these relationships, collective relationships to place. They also have a governance system of collective action that acts as a support system. They have a saving group, a network, which is a network leadership model. So it's not one leader, but different leaders, and composed by women mainly. And they've improved their life from working together over time. And they also connect with other communities facing similar issues. So this collective is also very important as a support network. And what happened in this settlement was that in early 2000s, the government declared the village as area for systematic land registration. But the area was excluded, mainly because it bordered two areas of state public land, one lake, you can see in the photo, and an empty plot, which is in the middle of the community. And what happens in Phnom Penh is that because also the public land is not registered, the state maintains an environment of ambiguity in which they don't know what is going to happen with this land, so they, I guess, exclude areas from registration so that they can register and do their plans when the moment is right. And this is what happens in this area. These plots were converted to private land, and they were planned to be sold to developers. And this happens across the whole city. So you can see this wetland, and it has been transformed and filled for development. And this happens all over Phnom Penh, and lake filling has been directly related to exclusion and forced evictions. So the people here organize, they expand their networks with other actors in the city, especially a key donor that was working with within the government at that stage with land registration. They produce legal and spatial information, make their exclusion case visible in public forums, and use the law to legitimize the claim. And so collective action here was used as power as well. And at the end, they received systematic land registration from the state. People were very happy and very important that this registration came through. However, when you start thinking about questions of recognition, I wonder, because people here say, we want to see the city develop, but in a way that benefits both the poor and the rich, where equality can be achieved between the rich and the poor. At the moment, the poor always cry when development starts. How is this fair? So their claim for justice, for equality, goes beyond receiving land title. But this is my view. This is not the people's view, and this is not the people's view in many NGOs and many other actors in the city that advocate for land title as land rights. But in my view, it's not enough. And also, when I started also doing research and talking to the families here, I found that this registration and the fact of receiving title makes some families vulnerable. For example, I have 3 examples. The couple here, they were very scared of borrowing money, so they had a large plot of land, and they were planning to subdivide part of their land and sell it in the future when they receive land title. The lady here, she was the opposite. She was really proud of her house, of living, you know, she was a migrant, a rural migrant. They came in with her husband, had children. They sold all their goods and invested everything in their house, which was actually in the border of the lake, so it was very contested. And they used the title of the mother in the province to get some money. So she had many different loans, and it was quite risky. And the couple here, the other one, the husband, he had an accident in his life, and so he cannot work. And so I guess they are vulnerable when the title comes, because again, they can be subject to you know, different actors even selling their land very quick if they get the title and get moved to other parts of the city because they can not sustain their livelihood. So title becomes very attractive as a financial instrument. And also I found a loss of collective action and support networks over time in this community. So when I was there was a process of gentrification happening from newcomers. So people from the center of Phnom Penh was moving to this area and buying, you know, land from different families. There was also some migrants coming to this community from the provinces, and I guess those social dynamics affected the collective action in the area. Also, there were generational difference in how land was valued. So people that had gone through the struggle of building their community and organizing together, they valued the land very, very much, especially the women. They were very scared that the children were going to receive title and sell it. And these changes were happening there, which make also land security a question mark. And also the saving capacity of people in getting more debt was reducing. So the saving group was actually diminishing. And also the interest in collective activities. So I just want to end with a few conclusions from a PhD. I guess this study shows structural processes creating urban inequalities and affecting residents of informal settlements in contemporary cities. These structural processes are very important to understand, especially when we talk about collective action, and it's important to contextualize collective action and processes within these forces and look at the impacts that these forces are having in collective processes. Also, of course, the limitations of market-led responses to urban informality, and I guess the importance of opening space for the collective in planning and land administration systems. And I guess that's very interesting to look at that. And we've discussed many people have discussed this in this conference, which I think it's an important thing to do, and really emphasize the importance of research into this process and the understanding how they work and what are also the limitations. And also, the last point, it's important to find ways of ongoing community mobilization and collective action at scale, so not only spatially, but also socially, so that those bonds can endure over time. So yeah, I leave you with that, and thank you.
Good evening. I'm Deepshri Arya. I'm a research associate at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. The work I'm presenting now is actually from my master's thesis. This study is situated in Coimbatore, in Tamil Nadu. The idea initially was to see how urban restructuring impacts livelihoods of women, but however what came through was the role of the state in this process. So to set the context, I will begin with just describing the field. How does the pointer?
Just the top.
Okay, good. So this is, while the Google map says these are lakes, these are actually tanks. So this is the Kumaraswamy tank, and my primary field site was this settlement along it. There are 3 different areas, but I'm not going to get into why they're segregated in that way in this presentation. So this settlement is called the Muthunakulam settlement. It started emerging about 90 years ago. Since the 1930s, with the outbreak of plague, when the state started pushing the poor people outside the city limits. The city sort of started growing around it. Today it's about 3 kilometers in length and has about 2,500 households. Abutting this is the Selvampati tank, and that there is the Tamil Nadu Civil Supplies Corporation, which basically is a warehouse for the PDS scheme. That's the Pusaripalayam settlement abutting. So this is also sort of an informal settlement with a few houses that have pattas. Then beyond this is an upcoming gated community with a view of the Sarambati tank and these agricultural land in Coimbatore. So this is the splendid view that the person gets. If you go into, so I also interviewed the developer, and I went into the model house. So while the people are being, while they're awed by the excellent interior design, and they're wearing plastic coveralls for their shoes to not damage the marble flooring. There's one concern that strikes the buyer would obviously be the blot. This on the serene view would be the settlement lying ahead, and the developer very frankly said that, well, that's going to be cleared owing to the Smart Cities mission, owing to moreover the Tamil Nadu. The Tamil Nadu Protection of Tanks and Eviction of Encroachers Act of 2007. So this is the view from the settlement of the gated community. And now, having set this context, I'm going to then unpack my evidence about the role of the state. So when I'm talking about policies towards quarter settlements, there are 3 actors that are determining the policies, particularly in Tamil Nadu, which is the 2 main political parties, the DMK and the AIADMK, the rising private interests, and also the development banks. Then I will talk about the legal discourse, which is basically judicial activism through BILs, and then I will discuss about the resulting spatial inequality. So starting with the policies, policies in towards squatter settlements in Tamil Nadu have, they've shifted from rebuilding and demolition to in situ upgradation with tenure security, and then finally to eviction and resettlement. So the role of DMK and AIDMK would be in the 70s, basically, DMK was promoting housing as a very strong policy plank, as a welfare measure and an important policy plank to redistribute societal resources. So it essentially viewed these these settlements as representing social negativity, and these should be demolished so that people are moved into better housing. Now, this was also the time when both the parties responded to the cadres who had considerable influence over decisions of the high-ranking officials. And also in the 70s is when the Tamil Nadu Slum Clearance Board, which is a parastatal body, was set up, but at that point it had no prominence whatsoever. The tension came in the 90s with the onset of globalization and with the increased capital flow and with the centralized control of land, as well as increased interest of increased private interest in land and centralization within parties, that the influence of local leaders started diminishing and parastatals started becoming increasingly important, because they were also headed by bureaucrats. And at this point, it's also important to note that currently in Coimbatore, the local body elections haven't been conducted for over 2 years. So the eviction is ongoing. The people are not able to respond to this eviction owing to the fact that there is no local body representative, and it's the parastatal which has no representative, just evicting and resettling people. Coming to the World Bank or the other development banks. So in the 90s again, Tamil Nadu essentially became a lab for all of World Bank's projects, and even now ADB has a number of infrastructure projects going on. And anyway, the receiving of these the receiving of the aid requires prerequisite conditions to be fulfilled. Now, for that to happen, a lot of the policies then started being influenced by the development bank. So, for example, the turn to evicting and resettling outside was a recommendation by the World Bank, and this was mainly owing to the land prices. And this is also evident in the master plan of Coimbatore, which is essentially not made by the corporation. Instead, it's made by a private firm, and it's a business plan which is talking about, which is criminalizing squatter settlements and terming them as encroachers and essentially viewing them as health hazards in the city. Then to talk about the changes in the legal discourse. So in recent years, basically, the court has resorted to environmentalism and using environmentalism and the changing definitions of public interest to legitimize these this exclusionary treatment towards the urban poor. Particularly when I take the example of Coimbatore, public interest litigations were so basically this in Tamil Nadu, the act that I was talking about that is being used to resettle people outside of Muttanapallam is the Tamil Nadu Protection of Tanks and Eviction of Encroachment Act of 2007. I'm just going to refer to it as the Act of 2007 from now on. So it was drafted as a response after the PIL, after a PIL was filed. In 2007, The PR was actually to ask for protection for people against eviction in a district in Tamil Nadu, but then the court actually used it as, this is a quote from the judgment, the court used it as a time to set this, to set a standard, and the state was directed to save the natural resources from encroachments by unscrupulous persons in the interest of the people. And so it took it as an opportunity to set an example, which is what led to the Act. However, the Act and a later judgment also say that encroachments in water bodies and water courses, such as houses, bus stands, factories, etc., constructed either with permission of the state by way of reclassification or issuance of patta or without permission of the state are illegal. So now this is important because when I'm talking about the settlement, what comes through is how violations of law by the state are then strategically tolerated. So the enforcement is basically very selective. While Muthunakolam tank, the settlement around that is being evicted, the Salampati tank settlement is not. Possibly because of two reasons. One is the settlement and the gated community, well, they are in tandem with the vision of world-class cities. And secondly, Muthunakolam is also located close to this mainstream residential locality, and the land prices are skyrocketing. And secondly, the state itself, so there are two other tanks, there are 8 tanks in Corridor, out of which 2 others were used by the state to actually create resettlement tenements, which this is in another area, but the state themselves use those tanks as resettlement tenements, and people are being housed there. And so basically, the point here is that how the state is playing a strategic role explicitly and implicitly. So while explicitly it's issuing court orders and implementing acts and providing licenses on the one hand, on the other hand, it's using also informal tactics, and so this implicit use of informal tactics is part of the power structure of the state. So this the fact that there was no legal notice served to the people of Muthunakolam, the fact that when they're being resettled, they're being given a license and they're being promised patta, but when they will get it is not known. The fact that they are being, so I mean, what all of this amounts to is, of course, like, I'm now coming to the spatial inequality part. So, I'm sorry. Okay, yeah, just one more slide. So over here is where the settlement is, and they're being resettled to somewhere there, which is about 25 kilometers away. And so now, what's important to see is, while they argue that that the people are being given resettlement, how do you and they're being given housing? How do you look at housing? Housing is not just 4 walls or a physical structure, but when they're being relocated to a distance like this, their employment opportunities, accessibility, mobility, all of this is curtailed. Access to basic services like hospitals, childcare services, all of that is problematic. And this housing is also a vertical structure, so essentially there's no room for incremental expansion. And the problem is, housing here is, at least in urban settlements, it is not just a place of living, but also sometimes place of work. So when you can do incremental expansion and the outside spaces, they don't just help with livelihoods, but also in terms of community and social relations. And livelihood in that sense can also not be seen as just work, but like flexibility of work. So if you're being located in a space where in the morning, so for example, there are a lot of women I met at the settlement who are domestic workers by day, and by evening they're either street vendors or basically vegetable sellers, or they're doing home-based work. So all of this is not possible when you're located far off. So I'm just briefly going to discuss, I think, 2 cases. No. Okay, so probably this can come up in questions. But so to conclude, basically, there are a lot of women who also identified as home-based workers. So these, and there were within the settlement, there were industries for flower making, bookbinding, and the calcium powder that's used in construction. So these were essentially within the horizontal housing units or in the outside spaces. So the relocation then had a direct impact on this. Thank you.
I'd like to open it up to the floor for questions, and in the interest of time, I think we'll do one round of questions actually. So.
Hi, thank you for the presentations. All of them are very interesting. At least I've been working for more or less a year here in India, and I've had the opportunity to work on frameworks related to smart cities in Puri, in Odisha, and also in frameworks related to the buffers of water systems here in Bangalore. So more or less all of them go to the same point. My question is, the diagnosis is more or less clear, no? Like how planning or the city development is being used as an extractivist apparatus for the city. So my question basically is, now what? Like, how do you see what is strategically a way to somehow contest this? The work that I've been doing is more or less trying to processes that are already ongoing, try to shift in a small room for maneuver to push a little bit to somehow the other side. But it's, I don't know, maybe it's just making it more reinforcing even, I don't know. That's my question. Thank you.
Actually, my question is very related to the last one, in the sense that have you met any progressive planners, and if you have you come across what tactics are they using in this context and to try to deal with the challenges that you are facing? Did you find any ideas around that would be interesting to hear?
Thank you. I would like to seek the panel's comments on the kind of accumulation regimes, because I thought somewhere we would reach that point also, but maybe if it would be nice if we can talk about like kind of accumulation regimes, the modes with respect to land and the role of state in it.
This was a question to the Phnom Penh presentation where I learned a lot about, and I wanted to just ask about, because we talked about specificities of a locality, of a location, basically, and you talked about the collective action that was developing in that community, and given the history and even the social kind of restructuring that happened during the Khmer period and things like that, whether you came across the influence of certain dynamics around kind of that breaking of social links and trust in the neighbor kind of a thing, and also that it's a matriarchal society, or I'm not sure if that's the right term, but how the women in the household generally hold a lot of power in terms of, managing finance or that kind of thing, whether those had implications on the way that the collective action was taking place or relationships were building around that. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Next.
Right. So the problem of what comes next and how we respond, perhaps, I think we can all turn to an essay by Peter Marcuse from 2009 in Cities entitled From Critical Urban Theory to the Right of the City. And in that essay, he proposes that, that we need a pedagogy that first exposes what's happening, right? And that provides the basic information and data, the description of what's happening. And I think we're good at that. I think we have that figured out, right? And then he says we need to propose. We need to propose, right, what the solutions are, the what does come next. And how do we build, right, that urban imaginary, if you will, right, of equity and equality. And then the third step, and this is where we fall down pretty hard, right? And Marcuse says we have to politicize. We get really nervous about that. We get really nervous about being political. We get really nervous, right, as academia because we're supposed to be in the ivory tower and somehow distant, right, from the political struggle. So I strongly recommend having a look at that essay and what Marcuse is talking about there. The last point that I would make is the urgency of the planetary crises that we face, and I suspect everybody in the room is aware of that, feels that, and is deeply concerned about it. But the urgency of the moment demands radical action. We are using the language and the discourse of the way of thinking that got us into the trouble that we now face. And I'll go back to the basic point. If we're using the right to the city concept as a way to conceptualize a more fair and just society, that is a radical proposition. An inclusionary proposition is reformist. Reformist to the core. And if we stay in that space, we are in huge trouble as a species. We won't make it, to be blunt. Things like Sustainable Development Goals, Habitat 3, create smart cities. And that's what we're doing. That's how we're going to solve the planetary, right, crises, smart urbanism. If we do that, game over. So what comes next? We have to figure out how to stop it.
I think one has tried during various projects to see when one was consulting, to see what is an approach which is different or what can one do. And like I said, the thesis was kind of really trying to understand, is there an alternative? Why is it we're not able to make much headway? But having said that, I would say that there are successes and there are stories I've been part of one very interesting, the Goa regional plan, where 80% of the state through planning action was declared eco-sensitive zone. So it's a statutory, plan now. So I think it can be a powerful tool, the spatial plan. The way it is set up today in India and in many parts of the world, most policies are spatial. And I think I see spatial planning as a very powerful tool to actually conserve and take certain agendas ahead. Unfortunately, in this country, definitely, planning is economic and it stops there and it's not translating into spatial. But if you combined spatial planning and actually did the bottom up, the local plans, through a participatory framework, I think, so Goa actually had that. It was at a scale that it was possible. So we did some very interesting settlement plans drawn up by the community, and very, very interesting exercise. So I was really excited about that, and the people were very engaged, and they scrapped the previous plan because it was pro capital, and the land was entirely opened up for development. So the task force that was constituted by the CM actually comes up with an alternative plan that conserves. But Goa is also, in one sense, we have to remember, a special case because tourism is a big industry. So conserving the environment does go hand in hand in that state. So it is different, and but it does show us a way ahead. I would say that very recently in the Mumbai Metropolitan Regional Plan, at least a framework has been put in for a blue-green network at a metropolitan scale. I don't know if it will get actualized, but it was great to actually put it in, so it's there. And hopefully it recognizes the need for this kind of structure. So I think that there is an alternative, and there are lots of very young planners who, or even practices like consultancies that have a different agenda. I personally, having worked with Aegis for the Mumbai DP, which was scrapped, we took certain agendas ahead. We tried very hard. So, it's not for lack of trying. And at times you find a receptive government at the other end. You find an official who is willing to listen. So I would say that there are a lot of progressive planners. Again, an ex-chief planner of India who believes completely and has been pushing for the 73rd, 74th, Edgar Ribeiro. Fantastic. I mean, the amount I've learned from him on how to listen to people and how to take things from the community. I think there's a lot that planners, and I think, so that's one way ahead, I would say, that if you believe in something, really push hard and try for it. But, and I would say the starting point and everything has to be the environment and, the context. It's unfortunately not the way planning is practiced, in general. But I would say that, and right now, teaching. I think, I think it's very, very important. So we are trying to create that new knowledge about our own cities. I think it's not there, and we are trying to create. So in places wherever I'm engaged in right now, through our labs, we are creating knowledge about how are our cities working, and we have labs where we're looking at the street and building these knowledges. So the last semester we have studies on 5 market streets in Mumbai. So we finally have data. I'm hoping that this then becomes available and planners start using it. I was having conversations with Viego, Shalini Sinha yesterday, and she said, send it to me. We can, put it into the NIUA. So I think hopefully we start creating new knowledge about our cities, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think in the context of Phnom Penh, it's important to think about planning not only from the state, but from the civil society. I think that there's a lot of initiatives by civil society that are very important, and in my opinion, they are doing all the planning, the community planning. And I think what I saw was when all the donors pulled out the funding. So I went to some of the communities, and people were very, they have very low, attitude because they lost credibility. Like a lot of the leaders, they lost credibility with their communities because nothing happened from all the sort of mapping that they did and all the mobilization, and they were just starting to save money again together. So I think, as much as possible, flexible, finance that go directly to the people, even small money. That I think whatever activity, it's very important, and that's how planning in Phnom Penh at least it's happening. In terms of your question, yes, of course, you cannot talk about collective action in Cambodia without considering the impacts of the civil war, and there is a lot of mistrust within the people in general. In my thesis, I do describe why this community is a bit different. Mainly, they are not at the lowest level of poverty. So I guess their priorities change a little bit, and they are able to organize better. Also, the leadership was very important, and they have a lot of different support from different NGOs, and the people were very committed. And the role of women, as you say, it's pretty key here. But it's been a learning process. It's not, I mean, they had some leaders, then they change, and then they had different problems. They had domestic violence as well. So it's just a learning process that has evolved over time, and that's important to think about when you think about collective action. Yeah, and it just fluctuates all the time. Yeah.
So I think everyone's answered the question on planning. There was one question which was asked about the role of the state, which I guess I'll just... I think the role of the state in primitive accumulation, at least in my case study, has come out very clearly in terms of where, land, like the claim to land that the poor have in terms of, for accessing basic services. Like in one settlement is being evicted, while the gated community as well as the other settlement, which looks and matches the aspirations of the neoliberal economy, their claims are not being questioned. So I guess that's just what I have to say.
I'd like to thank all the panelists, and I think there were a lot of things to think about that came up during the papers, and in the answers and the responses, I also felt that there was a note of hope and positive sort of ways to think forward. So that's kind of really nice, because we've sort of listened to 3 days of a lot of things which have been difficult, but this is a nice note to end on. So thank you so much. I think we're going to go directly into the plenary. We have run over a little bit in terms of time. So I would ask people to not sort of 5 minutes. Okay, so like 5 minutes break, and then please come back, right? Thank you.